All right, here we are this morning reading Stalin's Closed System of Colossus, written and read by me, Abe Zucca. I am an artist in downtown Phoenix. You can check out my website at zuccagallery.com. And you can come into my gallery in downtown Phoenix at 1301 Grand Avenue. So today we're going to start with cultural statecraft, Stalinism, intellectual life, and the politics of interpretation. What was totalitarian about Stalinism was not the actual achievement of the system, but the intentions of the ruler. Culture became an important tool for the government as it sought different arguments to justify its right to rule. It was a set of tenets, policies, and practices instituted by the Soviet government, but not a civilization in and of itself. Cultural statecraft. We are reading the Closed Systems of Colossus, Stalin's Closed Systems of Colossus, written and read by me, Abe Zucca. Please like and subscribe. Ask questions. Let's begin. On the parasitic nature of power, the instrumentation of culture, and the production of consent under duress. Every authoritarian order discovers sooner or later that force alone cannot secure its duration, and so it learns to harvest from culture a subtler generative power to be legitimating, to be inspiring, to be national, even when the content of the culture is far older, more plural, and more unruly than the order that appropriates it. The central paradox of Stalin-era cultural life is, while the state demanded omnipotence, it never achieved omnipotence. At every edge of control, there existed an interpretive remainder. Scholars, musicians, critics, logicians, who shaped their fields according to internal criteria, even when outwardly conforming to official norms. To name the structure of Stalinism as it were a coherent culture is to repeat a methodological error. The regime was not a culture, but a statecraft, parasitic upon culture's existing limitations and institutions, and dependent on the very intellectual resources it periodically repressed. Violence was the visible skeleton of the political machine. The culture was its bloodstream, and it flowed ambivalently, carrying both nutrients and toxins, sustaining a regime while also permitting forms of thought it could neither fully supervise nor fully abolish. Every cultural actor of the era learned a double grammar, the grammar of ideological prudence, by which one survived, and the grammar of intellectual fidelity, by which one continued thinking. These two grammars rarely aligned, and the tension between them produced the defining texture of Soviet intellectual life. The success of the regime depended not on fear, but on the ability of individuals to imagine themselves as participating in a grand construction. Yet the imaginative consent was never purely produced from above. It was co-authored by the desire of cultural agents to preserve meaning in a system that demanded its amplification. Interpretive entanglements on scholarship, ideology, and the negotiation of autonomy. In Stalin-era humanities, every concept bore two faces: the face turned towards the party, stressing class consciousness, dialectical materialism, patriotic purpose, and the face turned towards the discipline itself, philology. philosophy, logic, musicology, aesthetics, or more enduring intellectual problems persisted beneath the surface of conformity. The humanities did not cease to function under dictatorship, rather they functioned under transformed conditions of risk, where scholarship had previously answered to tradition, pure critique, or internal method. It now answered first to political survivability and only second to intellectual coherence. Yet this rearrangement produced not silence but mutation, new theoretical hybrids, new technological evasions, new formal innovations, the patriotic strategy, the dialectical defense, the scientific translation of ideology, all of which allowed cultural figures to do their work without fully surrendering it. The truth of the era is not found in the slogans, but in the footnotes, translation choices, bibliographic inclusions, methodological digressions, minute gestures by which thinkers smuggled traditions forward beneath the radar of state-sanctioned discourse. The more repressive the conditions, the more ingenious the strategies. Soviet scholars developed techniques of indirect expression, structural emphasis, critical paraphrase, selective citation, controlled opacity, that allowed them to build conceptual repertoires whose political acceptability was a surface layer over deeper intellectual continuity. Thus, the humanities of Stalin era were not merely victims of repression, but laboratories of interpretive invention, where the necessity of survival produced forms of thought that were neither orthodox nor fully clandestine, but something else, ambivalent fidelity under ideological constraint. Memory, distortion, and the historical imaginary. A transitional category I can expand if desired. I will. Every war produces generations of memory. And Cold War memory, layered atop Stalin-era violence, has made it nearly impossible to interpret the period without inherited distortions, demonization, romanticization, totalization, and reductive moral binaries. To study Stalin-era culture requires unthreading three intertwining imaginaries: the regime's own mythological self-representation, the Cold War's counter-mythology of totalitarianism, and the lived cultural practice that belonged to neither framework yet operated within both. Because culture always exceeds the intentions of the state, even oppressive inadvertently cultivates alternative futures, suppressed philosophies, musical theories, conceptual vocabularies, philological traditions, each writing to be rediscovered by later scholars who can see past the political conditions of theirs. Axioms of scholar under duress. On the interior life of thought within systems of coercion, a scholar under an authoritarian order becomes a cartographer of invisible boundaries. Every sentence must be placed with the precision of one who knows that a misplaced metaphor can be fatal, while well-placed ambiguity can preserve a lifetime's intellectual labor. The scholar's true archive in such times is not only the published work, but the unspoken hesitation, the avoided topics, the coded turns of phrase, the footnotes that gesture towards a tradition they dare not fully name. Absence becomes a secret index of presence. Duress turns thinking into a choreography, steps forward, steps sideways, calculated stillness. The scholar learns that silence can be as expressive as writing, and that the survival of a concept may require its temporary concealment. Under the pressure of ideological scrutiny, intellectual autonomy does not vanish, it redistributes itself. What cannot be said in public migrates into method, into structure, into interpretive habits, and thus autonomy becomes atmospheric rather than declarative. The true tragedy of the scholar under duress is not only external censorship, but self-censorship, the slow calcification of thought as one internalizes the gaze of power, until one can no longer distinguish between genuine conviction and the reflexive anticipation of danger. And yet, paradoxically, the same pressure that threatens to extinguish thought often sharpens it, forcing scholars to clarify what they value most, what they most protect, what they can relinquish, and what they will carry forward in coded form for future generations. Thus, the scholar under duress lives in a double temporality, one time dictated by the regime's urgency, the other by the long continuity of intellectual life. The later is where the true work occurs, hidden inside the former's shadow. Every field under dictatorship produces its own survival genre. For philosophers, paradox for musicians, interpretation for linguists, etymology for mathematicians, abstraction for critics, allegory. These genres form a clandestine phenomenology of endurance. Every regime that lacks cultural legitimacy seeks to borrow it. Parasitically from the artists, scholars, and intellectual traditions it simultaneously represses. Violence and patronage become two hands of the same body. One seizes, the other seduces. Parasitic statecraft does not create culture, it metabolizes existing forms, attaching itself to whatever symbolic resource are most capable of generating obedience, unity, or the appearance of historical inevitability. The paradox of authoritarian patronage is that it elevates culture only to instrumentalize it. The state finds art, literature, scholarship, and music not to be celebrated, not to celebrate their autonomy, but to cultivate the illusion that the state itself is the generative source of meaning. Violence enforces boundaries of permissible creation. Patronage decorates the boundaries with the aesthetics of national purpose. Together they form a system where culture activities is both tolerated and domesticated. But parasitism always produces leakage. No matter how carefully curated, the state's appropriation of culture cannot fully control interpretation. Audiences misread, scholars innovate, artists smuggle nuance, and the parasite never fully consumes the host. Indeed, culture retaliates in subtle ways. A theory presented as loyal may carry within it the seeds of critique. An aesthetic form endorsed by the state man preserved contradictions the state cannot perceive. A state-approved narrative may harbor alternative futures. The more a regime depends on cultural legitimacy, the more vulnerable it becomes to cultural reinterpretation. Patronage empowers the producers of meaning, even when it intends only to domesticate them. Thus, the parasite relation is always unstable. The state seeks cultural authority, but culture seeks interpretive autonomy. Their conflict generates the distinctive intellectual atmosphere of the Stalin era, neither total domination nor genuine freedom, but a tense and creative co-presence. Post-revolutionary intellectual life on the burden of historical rupture, experimental ideologies, and the reinvention of culture after upheaval. Every revolution imagines itself to inaugurate a new humanity, but its intellectual life is always a fortune teller. Beneath the rhetoric of beginnings lies a densely layered sediment of older traditions, academic lineages, and abandoned utopias. Post-revolutionary intellectual culture lives in contradiction. It must construct new doctrines while relying on the very expertise, institutions, and vocabularies inherited from the order it has overthrown. Thus produces a distinctive tension. The desire for rupture coexists with the need for continuity. The more a regime insists on the novelty, the more the most secretly depend on what it claims to have transcended. Thus, post-revolutionary scholarship oscillates between purification and synthesis. Some thinkers attempt to purge old categories, others attempt to reconcile them with new ideological horizons, both gestures are inevitably incomplete. The early Soviet decade were an archive of such incomplete syntheses. Phenomenology mingled with Marxism, classical philology with ideological critique, musicology with political pedagogy, mathematical logic with dialectical rhetoric, hybridization born not from theoretical harmony but from historical necessity. Post-revolutionary intellectual life is marked by an experimental fragility. Each concept, method, and discipline is under negotiation, and the boundaries of legitimacy shift with political winds. This fragility produces both innovation and precarity. The greatest intellectual achievement of the Stalin era in language, theory, aesthetics, philosophy of culture, musicology, and mathematics emerged not from ideological fidelity but from the ability to work through contradictions without succumbing to it. And because post-revolutionary societies inherit unresolved violence, their intellectual life carries an ethical burden: how to think rigorously while acknowledging complicity, how to produce theory under conditions where thought itself has been conscripted into political ends. The scholar in such an era becomes both witness and participant. Their work records not only the content of ideas, but the structure of a historical moment where thinking, surviving, and interpreting were inseparable acts. Okay, that's into part 4, Stalin's Closed Systems of Colossus. Check out my art at zuccagallery.com. Google Abe Zucca. Check out my stuff online. Anyways, I'll see you guys later.